Hello, you're watching the TelecomTV Summit on the Green Network and our panel discussion on energy efficiency targets for new infrastructure. I'm Guy Daniels, Director of Content. When sourcing new infrastructure equipment, what emphasis should telcos place on energy consumption and efficiency? And what work is still required to ensure that energy efficient infrastructure is available to all telcos, great and small? Well, with the help of our guests, we are going to find out. And joining me today are Irene Zhang, who is Director Product Marketing, Cloud Metro and Security at Juniper Networks. Beth Cohen, who is SDN Product Strategies at Verizon. Mark Gilmour, CTO for ConnectiviTree Europe. And Tuoyo Ebigbeyi, who is VP Innovation and Strategy Energy at American Tower. Hello everyone, very good to see you all. Thanks so much for taking part in our discussion. So how important is energy efficiency as a criteria for selecting new infrastructure and equipment, not just in the power-hungry radio elements, but throughout the network? How does it stack up against other purchasing criteria? Mark, perhaps we could get your views on this first.
Thank you very much, Guy. Actually, this is really pertinent to us right now in ConnectiviTree because we are building a new company, we're building a new network. And so this is first and foremost in our thoughts. I suppose my first point to note is we're building out a new data transport network for across international borders. One of the things we've been focused on is, first of all, you kind of look at the functionality and the capability of network equipment vendors, etc. But then very quickly we're looking at the environmental impact, the energy efficiency, for example, and that's twofold. One, from our own ESG sort of targets and our function, really, I suppose, as a new company coming new into the industry and new into the global industry as such. So we've got that on one side, but also there is a cost implication. There is a cost. There is an operating cost point to that, and so really we're looking at it twofold. First of all, we got to nail the form, the functionality, and capability, and then it becomes very quickly a criteria selection for us in terms of power efficiency for cost and to also meet our own ESG policies and targets that we're setting.
Thanks, Mark. That sounds like it's encouragingly high up the agenda there. Beth, from Verizon's perspective, are we seeing energy efficiency as one of the key purchasing criteria now?
Absolutely. It's one of our key purchasing criteria. We are focused. One of our major goals, we have a number of strategic goals, and part of our mission statement is to be energy efficient and to be, give back to the planet. And that includes, reducing our carbon footprint and reducing our energy consumption, and as was previously mentioned, obviously cost affects it as well. But we are looking at, when we look at equipment, we're looking at the energy footprint as part of the equation. That goes right into our RFPs.
Thank you very much, Beth. And Tuoyo, what are you seeing here over at American Tower?
Absolutely. I think Beth and Mark covered the points quite well. I think the only addition I would add is, we are at an interesting point when you think about the cloudification of the networks, the rise of data consumption in significant amounts. If you look at the average consumption per user, a couple of years ago, maybe it was about 2 to 3 gigabytes per month, and that's hovering north of 30, 40 in some instances. That's driving the need for a lot of power intensity as core customers like mobile network operators deploy these 5G or 5G networks across our portfolio. And so when you couple that with the key points that I've mentioned earlier, which are cost and also the need to become greener and more sustainable, you've got this perfect situation where the need for energy efficiency all across the value chain of telecommunications infrastructure becomes more poignant and pertinent than it's ever been, in my career in telecoms.
Wow, that's great. Thanks very much, Tuoyo. And Irene, from the vendor perspective, you give us a different perspective on this. Are you seeing the requirements for energy efficiency increasing?
Absolutely. So for IFP, energy efficiency has always been there for the past 5-10 years. However, in the past, that is more of a checklist item. But what we see over the last 2-3 years, it actually becomes a critical criteria where if the vendor is not providing specific numbers, then even though the overall solution may be even cheaper or have lower cost of ownership, it will still not proceed to the next step for the bid process.
Thanks, Irene. In fact, I'd like to stay with you now because I want to ask whether or not you're seeing, well, let's look at different hardware. We have lots of different hardware in our networks. All different hardware have got different energy requirements. But do we collectively have an agreed level of power usage for new equipment? Do we as an industry put a figure on this yet?
From what we see, we haven't seen like an agreed upon number yet. And in fact, I would argue that it really needs to have a number for same category. So we can't compare apples to orange. And an analogy that I like to use is when we think about home, let's say a smart home, you have different appliances. Same thing that in your network infrastructure, you have different equipment across different domains. And when you look at each individual equipment, so let's say in your home, your refrigerator versus your TV versus your coffee makers, those are just by default, they are going to consume different levels of energy. So putting a same number to them would not make sense. Now, it makes sense when you are comparing, let's say, refrigerator versus refrigerator from different vendor or TV versus TV, right? So that is how we see that. And it would make sense moving forward to have the industry to have some agreed upon number for the same category of solutions.
Yeah, so we could do a number, but we've got to make sure this is category specific. Thanks, Irene. Mark, what are your views on this?
Well, Irene's absolutely correct in that there isn't a kind of like a standard that I can look to and say, yep, that I can tick against that. What we have seen, for example, though, is sometimes vendors are trying to use comparative statements like or trying to put in sort of relative scale. Power per bit is used in that, but those can be misleading. If I look, for example, at the network that we're building, if I was to build that on equipment that was, say, 10 years old or 5 years old, using that generation of equipment, then the cost per bit or the power per bit would be considerably higher. Actually, we've done some studies looking at it. For example, the reduction level can be as much as 85% in terms of the power consumption per bit transported. However, that only comes into play when the equipment is fully utilized, and otherwise that power per bit figure can really ramp up very quickly if the network is not being fully utilized at that point. So there's attempts being made, but it's still not. We're not there in terms of having a clear guidance, clear way of looking at it comparatively and robustly, and I think verifiably. I've in my studies on this, in my learning on this, I've come across this term investor grade carbon accounting, and Yeah, I think that's difficult to get to. I'm used to the carrier grade sort of approach. Well, there's this accountability side of it as well.
Oh, very interesting, Mark. We've always got to read the small print very, very carefully here as to what we're actually getting. Beth, let's come across to you for some thoughts on this.
Yeah, I'd like to address it a little more broadly. I'm very familiar with in the U.S. we have the Energy Star system. Which when you go into a store and you see an array of refrigerators, each one has a number. The average amount of money you'll spend on this appliance running, and that would be great if we could get to that with the telco support infrastructure. However, I think it's a little more difficult because it's not a unit, right? The infrastructure is there's server boxes which are virtualized, running virtualized services, and obviously the cloud has reduced the carbon footprint significantly. And as Mark mentioned, it's all about being efficient, right? That's what that virtualization trend really was all about. Reducing the amount of idle spinning disks and idle CPUs, and so that's just one aspect of it. But anybody who's familiar with how data centers work know that the majority of the power is spent on cooling the systems, and so I think there's a lot of things that need to be looked at and optimized to get to that power per bit, and then be able to standardize across the industry. So, that's where I think the standards bodies really need to step in to, as an industry, across the industry, to work together to create those standards and to create the mechanisms for reducing those footprints.
Okay, thanks very much, Beth. And Tuoyo, did you want to come in on this particular talking point as well?
Sure. I mean, Beth just actually hit the point that was resonating with me, which is the value chain. I like the fact that she emphasized, cooling being a core component for, cloud networks or data center operations. And so as we think about, and 3GPP, the standards body for telecommunications, networks, as you will today, has done a fantastic job with, thinking about energy efficiency from a radio access network perspective. But the point that I think was very poignant, and I think both Mark and Beth hit on this, is as you think about the entire value chain, if you think about the Energy Star, it looks at scope emissions, and it looks at all the different component parts that go into making a refrigerator or a television. And I think we need to start evolving to that paradigm within telecommunications, where we start thinking about what are the cooling requirements, and how do the manufacturers that participate in that space sync and align with the sustainability and cost efficiency goals that telecommunications networks now require.
Thank you very much, Tuoyo. Thanks everyone for those comments. Well, we've been focusing so far on hardware for new infrastructure, but is the energy use of software also being considered in the same way as that of hardware infra? Beth, I know the issue of software is very close to your heart. What do you say?
The short answer is I don't even think it's on anybody's horizon, but it should be. Because software efficiency, software developers do not think in terms of, oh, if I write this code, it will reduce the power consumption. But they and we don't even really have the tools to allow them to even take that into consideration. I mean, I'll give you an example. It applies to edge as well, and the use of the network more efficiently, which again is going to drive down power consumption. To make sure that the software does the work in the appropriate place in the network, will reduce the amount of it'll reduce the latency, it'll reduce, improve customer experience with the software, but it will also reduce the power, the carbon footprint at the same time. And I think we just haven't even gotten to the starting point at this point with in that discussion. Virtualization is certainly, a component, but from the software developers' perspectives, it's not even on the roadmap yet.
Thank you, Beth. That's, it's so disappointing to hear from an industry perspective that, we haven't even got the tools yet to be able to address this. Mark, what about you? Do you believe the use of energy efficiency in software is being considered in the same way as hardware yet?
I agree with Beth on this one. No, I don't think it's truly being covered just yet. There's a slight irony that in the world of virtualization, as Beth mentioned it earlier, you disaggregate the software into hardware, spin down, an unused hardware, for example. But then if we've got an inefficient code and software that's running inefficiently, then taking that power saving that's been made by spinning the hardware down, and then actually the software is running more inefficiently, then essentially you lose that advantage. But I think it's also very much workload dependent, and I think an application, and sometimes we need to be careful as operators, as end users of these services, to say, actually, do we really need such power intensive applications or software to do a task? My example here would be, AI ML driven applications. I think the consideration question that needs to be raised there is, do I actually really need to run AI to do this application, or is it something that's kind of good, it brings a benefit, but is actually the benefit outweighed because you're actually having to, it's quite a power intensive sort of workload. I don't think those questions are being potentially considered at the moment. And I think that's part of the ongoing discussion, hence why we have these sort of summits to bring these points up.
Yeah, indeed. Thanks, Mark. And there's tough decisions there, isn't it? When you look at the benefits and you've got to weigh them all up. Well, moving on from software to the cloud, we touched on the cloud earlier in our discussion. As we see more increase in the use of public cloud by telcos, how does this usage affect energy? And in this situation, what control, if any, does a telco have over the energy usage, the power usage of power output of the cloud providers? Beth, what are your thoughts?
So sadly, the cloud providers hold all the cards in this regard because, of course, they're running the data centers there. And I will hand them kudos in that they are, in fact, cognizant of the their power requirements and are active in reducing their power needs as much as possible. But our interaction as a telco with these cloud providers is that we're just consumers of those services, and so we have little or no say in their efficiencies and their power consumption reduction. Our only way that we could possibly affect it is, harking back to the previous question related to software, can we write more efficient software that will, has a reduced footprint? And I think that's our only leverage in terms of supporting the reduced power consumption in with the cloud providers. Obviously we maintain our own data centers with our own clouds, and within those clouds, of course, the private clouds, we do have control, but the public clouds we don't.
No, thank you, Beth. Tuoyo, what's your views about how the increase in public cloud usage is affecting energy usage from telcos?
I think Beth hit the right points in terms of thinking about the fact that the current providers are working actively to mitigate their energy consumption. In fact, I read recently one of the big hyperscaler cloud providers decided to run their servers a little hotter to reduce, the cooling intensity required to keep those servers up and running. So those are just some of the techniques that are being used by the cloud providers to help increase energy efficiency. I think when you look at it broader, I think one of the key things that I'm seeing is this microcosms of activities taking place towards energy efficiency. I think Mark alluded to that point earlier, where he mentioned, you see power per bit, but the way it's looked within the cloud networks is a little different from the way that a radio access network may look at, the power energy efficiency. And so one of the things that I think we could do is really bring some of these key stakeholders together as we think about, the virtualizations of the networks, the cloudification of the telecommunications networks, how we can bring these key stakeholders together to expand the scope of how we currently look at telecoms infrastructure and architecture. And I think by sort of expanding the scope and bringing these key stakeholders that historically have sort of stayed on their swim lanes of ones and zeros, can potentially help increase the overall energy efficiency and performance that we see in telecommunications networks today.
Yeah, thanks, Tuoyo. You're absolutely right. We do this collaboration in order to understand each other and the angles, where we all come from. Mark, I'll come to you in a moment, but first, let's hear from Irene and your thoughts on this.
Yeah, so I agree with Beth that while there are not many control the telco have, but I would say in addition to choosing more efficient software, another thing to consider is to look at the nature of the application workload and choose the cloud instance that mesh the best with the workload. And that way, that also would improve the efficiency, the energy efficiency of those applications. Because think about it, when you have, let's say, fully loaded hardware, if it's same performance, the hardware is almost always more efficient than software. And the reason being that you have the processors, the equipment actually optimized to that workload. Now, when it comes to software, those are general purpose CPU. But if you pick certain processors and instances that are actually better suited for certain type of application, then you will get closer benefit to as if you are running the dedicated hardware. So that is another things to consider.
Oh, good points. Thanks very much, Irene, for that. And Mark, let's hear from you on this issue of public cloud use.
Thank you. I think if I was being disingenuous, I would say as an operator, it's kind of not my problem, because basically I've offloaded that problem to the public cloud providers, and it becomes a scope 3 emission for me. But ultimately, that's not going to solve the general problems that we have. So in reality, what that means is exactly what my fellow panelists have kind of brought up, is we start developing then how we utilize power more efficiently in those environments. But I'm not in the data centers market or space, but it is interesting that the way that data centers are and the cloud is sometimes referred to, or the new data centers as they come on stream, is they're spoken of in terms of their power capability, in terms of megawatts, in terms of how large a data center it is. And that's an ever increasing scale. I think one of the key drivers that needs to happen in that space is actually, renewables are an absolute table stakes for data center space. And when we are looking to purchase data center space, that's a key criteria we're looking at. Going back to the first question, really, in terms of what are the data centers providers doing in terms of their supply, even though it isn't a direct impact on my scope 1, scope 2 emissions, it is on scope 3 and my overall contribution as an operator into the industry. But I think one of the key movements that is happening and needs to happen is for data centers to have direct access to renewable sources rather than just through the grid. And we've seen examples of that starting to come on stream. And I think that's a critical part of the overall industry becoming more of a green network.
Yeah, great. Thank you very much, Mark. And we heard earlier in the summit about taking responsibility across the whole ecosystem, across all supply chains as well. Beth, let's come across to you for some additional thoughts on this.
Yeah, I have one more comment, which is that I know that the cloud providers, and I'm thinking of one example of a cloud provider that stood up their data center next to a hydro dam. So, so it was cheap, clean energy. Unfortunately, it was nowhere near the telco networks. So that data center, has struggled because of its location. So that's something that the telcos are probably more aware of than the cloud providers, about that the need to have the data centers close to population centers, for latency purposes and for efficiency of the network, and that you cannot put a data center in the middle of a place that's not well served by the telcos.
Indeed, thanks, Beth. It's a complicated set of equations you telcos have got to work on here to balance all this up and make it work and make it as energy efficient as possible. Which brings us on to our last question, really. And we've, to an extent, we've covered elements of this earlier, but what work is still required by the industry as a whole to ensure that energy efficient infrastructure is available, and not just to a handful of telcos, but to all telcos? Tuoyo, let me come across to you to start us off, please.
Absolutely, and I think you're right to say that a lot of the work that needs to be done, we've touched on in pockets during the discussion earlier. I'll break it down into 3 points, at least from my vantage point. I think the first one, really pertains to setting standards, holistic standards and metrics and targets that not just are applicable in microcosms, like we discussed earlier. I think Mark alluded to that, but across the entire ecosystem of telecommunications infrastructure. I think there's nothing more motivating than a North Star to keep key stakeholders working in tandem and in synchronicity to be able to achieve our energy efficiency goals, while also making sure that these solutions that we deploy are close to carbon neutral as possible, because we also have sustainability targets and ambitions as well. I think the second point is really around the ecosystem, or the value chain, and you could look at it from a combination of both hardware and software. And because I'm an infrastructure supplier to the mobile network operators, I'll take it from the hardware perspective. And we've seen that, I love the example that Beth mentioned earlier, cooling, for example, being a huge component of the whole power efficiency utilization for data centers. And so being able to think about all the different hardware components that go to supporting the network stack, the network infrastructure, and being able to bring those key providers, vendors, suppliers to bear, so that they all align towards making sure that the systems that we deploy at the edge, at the base station of a macro network, or even at the end user device, are more energy efficient, more cost effective, and overall optimal for our network and ambition needs. And the last one is really around the end user. I think there's a piece that we haven't really covered today in this discussion, is there's a proliferation of devices as the network expands. You think about 5G, you think about IoT, you think about network of networks, and all that means is more devices, more needs for data, and more needs for energy to help propagate the electromagnetic frequencies that go to those devices, at least wirelessly or even wired vis-a-vis optical networks for transport like fiber. And I think what role are the end user device manufacturers also playing to make those phones and computers and sensors more energy efficient, more in tandem with the networks that are being deployed today, such that you could have an overall efficient energy infrastructure as you advance and evolve within telecom. So it's a combination of those three: the end users, the value chain, as well as some of the standards that could drive, the first two that I mentioned, I think will really go a long way in getting us to a more energy efficient telecommunications landscape in the future.
Great, nice summary, Tuoyo, there, and you're absolutely right about the need for end-to-end efficiency across the whole of telecoms. Anybody else like to make some final comments on what we can do as an industry to improve the situation? Irene, let me come to you.
Yeah, so on that question about the making energy efficient infrastructure accessible to telcos, I think one thing that we all should think about is change require business case. And for transitioning to energy efficient infrastructure, it does require investment. So when it comes to business case, the industry can do, I would say, two things. One is for the early adopters, that when adopting the energy efficient infrastructure and for different domains, different parts of the network, document them and share what was the before and after in terms of energy savings, business outcomes. And those numbers would be tremendously helpful for other telcos to use it as a business case. And second is also consider for the industry standard body to collaborate with government to seek if there's any incentive, maybe even tax credit, something like that, that can help operators, perhaps rural operators, that make the initial investment easier to get it started.
Good points. Thank you, Irene, for those. And we'll go across to Mark as well for comments on what we can do to make the situation better.
One of the interesting things we can do actually is work better together as an industry. Actually, in more efficiently using our networks, because there's a baseline power requirement that is required to run a network, and incrementally adding capacity into that, particularly in my space, which is the kind of the wholesale large backhaul market, so international backhaul market, utilizing and maximizing the network capacity in those really makes a powerful difference to the efficiency. I think the other thing that I'd like to bring out is, and we've touched upon it in the session, is real verifiable and traceable sort of metrics that can be used. One of the things that I've, as we build our company and as we build our network, is that we have aspirations. Well, we had aspirations actually to try and be net zero from day one. Not achievable. One, because it's difficult to actually measure and account for that, and also we touched on that scope 3 sort of control we just don't have. But certainly as a company we can be carbon neutral from day one. But that requires very tight and accountable carbon accounting to be able to bring that in. And so these are the measures that we need to bring in and understand across the networks, across the industry, and then feed back in. And one of the things that I learned from this session, actually, I think Beth mentioned it, but interesting to see if we can actually run our equipment at slightly higher temperatures to reduce down the cooling required. I mean, that's a conversation for us to have with the vendor community, because that could make a significant difference.
It certainly could, and it's just another great example of the innovation that comes out of this industry that we sometimes overlook, that can help us in these situations. And you mentioned, the problems with measuring and monitoring. We had a whole panel session earlier in the summit about that, and it is so incredibly difficult. Now, we must leave it there. Thank you all so much for taking part in our discussion today and sharing all of your views. If you're watching this on day 3 of the Green Network Summit, then please do send us your questions and we'll answer as many of them as we can in our live Q&A show. And that is coming up very shortly. Don't forget to view the other panel discussions and interviews in this year's summit. But for now, thank you for watching and goodbye.